Hello everyone, welcome to this webinar focusing on how the planning system can and must deal with the climate challenge. My name is Jessie Feith and I'm a project manager at the Town and Country Planning Association, and I'm going to be chairing today's event. We all know that the impacts of climate change are happening faster and with greater intensity than predicted. And yet in many places, I think we can agree that there is very little evidence that the planning system is considering how these impacts will play out over the lifespan of development. We are being locked into irreversible pathways which will severely affect health and well-being of residents in years to come. This webinar aims to lay the groundwork of how local authorities can plan for the impacts of climate change and how important it is to embed effective policies at the local level. We have a mixed audience of people and we will be covering a lot of ground, but I hope you find it useful. This is just the start of the process, and we will be providing further online support sessions over the next few months, which will focus on the detail of particular planning problems. And we can also offer further support on a local authority case-by-case basis. So keep your eyes peeled for more information about this. We are delighted that so many people are able to join this webinar today. So thank you for finding the time to do so. And also thank you to Flood Re for sponsoring this event. Before we get started, I would like to invite you to respond to a short poll, which I will start now. So hopefully this has appeared on your screen, and we'd be very grateful if you could respond quickly to the 2 questions there. And while this is running, I'm just going to run through a bit of housekeeping. So the webinar will be recorded and will be available on the TCPA website shortly afterwards. So if you wish to refer back to anything, you can watch it again or share it with your colleagues. And we will also post the presentation slides, and we will circulate a link to all of you where you can find this. If you would like to ask a question to any of our panelists, please use the Q&A function. You can use this at any time during the webinar, but we will do all the questions and discussion at the end of the session. If you use social media, please do use the hashtag TCPA webinars. We will be tweeting from the TCPA account, so please do follow along there. So I hope we've had enough time to do the poll. I can end it now. And you can see that most people are from local government, which is what we expected, so that's great. And welcome everyone. So I think we should get started because we've got a lot to get through. So we have some great speakers coming up from TCPA, Flood Re, the Environment Agency and the Adaptation Subcommittee. You can see the agenda here, so hopefully it's going to be a really good session and be very useful. I'm going to hand over to my colleague Hugh, who is the Director of Policy at the TCPA, and he is going to give an introduction to what the planning system can do to help adapt to climate change, and perhaps also some insight into the government's planning reform agenda. Hugh, your turn. Thanks.
Well, thanks very much, Jessie, and I hope everyone can hear me okay. So I'm going to quickly run through sort of the background to the climate and planning challenge, and as Jessie said, along the way indicate kind of the scale of the crisis that we're facing and what we can do about it. But I want to reinforce the message that Jessie gave, which is that in the 30 years or so we've been working on climate change, the progress that we've made has not been sufficient. And it now turns out that less carbon in the atmosphere is simply having a bigger impact than we'd expected. So in that sense, the scale of the crisis that we're confronting with requires us to rethink and re-engineer places and attitudes and cultures to deal effectively with this agenda. So if you open your local plan or the report you've just written on a development management case, and it doesn't start with climate change, then you're starting in the wrong place, because this is the biggest problem and crisis confronting the future of human society. We say that a lot, but it is true. So I'll quickly run through some slides that give that background, and then hopefully begin to talk about the planning process, and then we can maybe have some debate about it. So next slide, please. So this is just a quick screenshot for an animation, which is really great, but well, I can't make work, but it just gives you a sense of the kind of temperature change that we've got, and the facts and the science about those changes over time. And they are extremely dramatic, and as you can see, they're also focused disproportionately in the polar regions, which is an important relationship on ice sheet melt and sea level rise. So next slide, please. And this is just an interesting graph of CO2 again. This is interesting to me because I am so old. I came into this debate when carbon parts per million in the atmosphere was about 360. And we were told then that 400 parts per million was pretty much game over for us. And you can see where we are now. So and this is important for our strategizing about climate change, because when you're presented with whether we're on low, medium or high emission pathways, it's very important to say that historically we've always been on high emission pathways. It's also important that we've got government ambitions on net zero by 2050 as a government. We can talk about zero carbon homes in a second. We've got a big proportion of local authorities adopting climate emergencies. But how does that translate into practical action? And we've also got the issue of increasing impacts, which are having an incredible impact on communities. Next slide, please. This is an important slide because it is about our understanding of the climate science, which is essentially in two major blocks of science, which planners need to understand a bit about. So there is the existing, what might be described science that's well understood through the IPCC process, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, which feeds through into what Sam will talk about in the Environment Agency, climate change flood risk allowances. Now that science is extremely powerful, but it is always slightly out of date. The really worrying thing for us all on climate change is that the science at the cutting edge, the most recent science, indicates much bigger impacts for much smaller warming factors globally. And this is an article about Antarctic sea ice melt, and you can see the visualizations there. And you can also see the factors of what a 2-degree warming might indicate in terms of this new science, which is a 2.5 meter increase in global sea levels. And this is important because there is no scenario beyond which sea levels don't rise dramatically and go on rising dramatically. So in thinking about when I'll talk about time in planning, that's why time is so important. You have to plan over the long term. Next slide, please. So we're already clear, again, from the Environment Agency that these risks are happening now. There's an increased exposure. And I suppose you can see the figures. I won't go through them in detail from the Environment Agency, but that exposure is growing. And there is a really important question about whether we are focusing development simply in the wrong place. It may be okay now, but is it going to be resilient over the long term? And that relates to what Catherine might say about insurance and the insurance compact that we'll talk about later on. So next slide. And I think the adaptation challenge, so mitigation and adaptation mustn't be dealt with separately. So trying to get people to take action to reduce carbon, as we all know, is quite hard. But the fuel, the political fuel for action on climate change is in fact the impacts that it creates, the adaptation challenge. But the problem with the adaptation challenge is that actually it's a very place-specific idea, which is why planning is so important to it. So it depends on particular geographies, on the diversity of people and communities and differing needs. And so understanding how to respond to climate change means a really detailed understanding of the specific characteristics of your place. So planning in the Calder Valley, for example, for adaptation is an extraordinary challenge, but it's different from the extraordinary challenge of planning for it in Skegness, because our geography presents different challenges and different kinds of flooding will plainly have different impacts in those places. But the biggest challenge as planners we face is time. So if I ask the question, how many plans are planning for climate change on more than a 10 to 15 year basis, the answer is very few. Actually, we're required by national policy to plan on a much longer term basis. So if your plan is not planning for a 50 to 100 year timescale on climate change, then your plan is not fit for purpose. I know it's ever so easy for me to say, but that's simply the way it is. You have to plan on long term, and the Environment Agency supports that approach. Next slide, please. So planning is simply very significant. I mean, I still think planning is the most important practice in the world and the most brilliant thing, because we're talking about answering the question about how people are going to live in this new future. But the power of planning is described there in terms of the number of permissions given and the number of permissions in the pipeline. So there's 1 million unbuilt homes in the pipeline at the moment. So the scale of change that planning deals with, and the reason this planning is so important, is it's the gateway test for much of this. So we've got to get people to understand that. But if you ask the question, how many local plans or even neighbourhood plans are really dealing with this challenge, then I think the answer is quite challenging there. So next slide, please. So this is all straightforward stuff for those of you who are planning officers working with planning all the time, but for those of you who aren't, the strong message here is that you have to embed the evidence base inside the local plan preparation process extremely powerfully. And that means that flood risk assessment process is really critical. I know Sam will talk in more detail about that. But it's important to understand, I suppose, that climate change is a dynamic force. So you've got to be understanding flood risk of where your floodplains are now, but where they're going to be, and where your coastline is going to be in 2050 and 2100, because the built environment has at least 100-year cycle. So the evidence base for local plan prep has to include those critical issues. Next slide, please. So development management, likewise, there are requirements here for flood risk assessment, and those are really critical in those applications that fall perhaps outside local plans. And that's a process that is extremely important to get right, particularly for, obviously, for major housing. And that we can come back and deal with the detail of that. But that is everything for how you embed the detailed measures in planning, like sustainable urban drainage, in the consents for new housing. So clear priority in the local plan filters through, or should filter through, into clear priorities in the development management process. All of this, of course, requires skills, knowledge, and awareness amongst everyone dealing with that, particularly the industry, the house building industry. And that's not always there. So next slide, please. So just to finish off, just a couple of points about the level of constant reform. So for those of you working in local government, I don't know how you all cope with the scale of continuous revolution produced by the government on planning reform. And it is something that the TCPA has been very worried about. Most importantly, there's a new planning white paper, and that white paper is taking us to a system where there are 3 kinds of planning in England: the growth, renewal, and protection zones that they're going to produce. I will only say that it's extremely controversial new programme. Whether it is all delivered is an open question. There's a lot of opposition to it. But importantly, the planning white paper does not create a framework that discusses how it's going to respond to flood risk. And that is a very important omission. There are separate processes going on, and we hope they'll be fully embedded in any new planning system. I would encourage people to get well stuck into responding to the consultation that closes on the 29th of October. But this is a system that, above all else, has to be tested for whether it works for climate change. So next slide, please. So that's the overall framework of policy and law, just as a quick reminder. And it is very important that that climate change duty, which is located in the Planning Acts, in section 19 of the Planning Acts, which does give a very powerful legal basis for action on climate change. And if you look at our guide we produced with the RTPI that's on our website, you'll see more detail on that. But the quick reminder is that local plans must have policy on mitigation and adaptation to climate change, not think about having them, but must have it. And that is very important because it enables the kind of framework which Sam Kipling from the Environment Agency will talk about. And it means that it is a clear priority for the planning system. And then the link over to the Climate Act, which is made in guidance, and then you can see the other legal framework set out there. The National Planning Policy Framework, the National Planning Practice Guidance are constantly up for review. Sam might say a bit more about where the practice guidance might be. And then obviously the critical importance of the local planning getting this right. And the dilemmas we might get into are, some local authorities are so horribly affected by flooding that their ability to grow in housing numbers is really profoundly restricted, and perhaps we should get into the argument of how they're going to manage that increased growth as well as climate impacts going forward. So next slide, please. So just a couple of final slides on the sorts of things that make me want to openly weep as a planner. So this is just a flood risk map and an indication of, in my patch, of the kind of housing that's being delivered. And when we're all face to face, we can have a lot more fun picking apart what's wrong with this housing design. Apart from the fact I wouldn't call it a design at all, it's interesting to see, what kind of, well, it has no back door for one thing, has no garden, but it also, interestingly, has a lot of tarmac. And I think actually it neither provides a good environment for people, it doesn't support their well-being, it doesn't support any action on carbon reduction because there's no PV on the roof, and there could be. But more importantly of all, it's not creating the kind of very positive environments that green infrastructure and absorbent surfaces and sustainable and green sods, green sustainable urban drainage systems can create. And this is very important in planning. Yes, this is a crisis, but we do have the technical solutions to build really fantastic places which do deliver on multiple outcomes from climate change to public health. Next slide, please. So I'm just going to end with this one because this is also the problem that local government has, I think, at the moment. So this is permitted development. So this is a development, this is converted into 15 flats and half of those were in the roof space with no windows. This is permitted development. And although in permitted development, you can think about some basic issues around flood risk, it gives you an indication, I suppose, of the fact that local government's lost quite a lot of power over its future. I have to say, I cannot believe as a professional planner that we're housing people in these kind of buildings. But in the future, there's all sorts of other issues about climate impact, overheating, for example, which are really important to include in the debate. So I know we're primarily talking about flooding and adaptation today, but in fact, the adaptation challenge is very much about creating great places for people. And simply these things are the slums of the future. So we have a climate challenge and a deregulation challenge. But I think that what my message to you all is that you have the legal basis and we have the evidential basis to create a much stronger action on climate change at the local level now. And we also, and that is vital if we're going to plan for the 50 to 100 year kind of time frame. And I'm sure Sam will talk about the climate change flood risk allowances, but I leave you with the thought that 1.2, 1.3 meters of sea level rise at least on our east coast by 2125 in 100 years time is an extraordinary challenge. In order to meet that challenge, you have to start now. It takes that long to be prepared. Okay, I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Hugh. Very depressing, but very useful presentation. Our next speaker is Catherine from Flood Re. She's the Senior Transition Specialist. Catherine is going to introduce Flood Re and talk about the importance of future insurance availability in development. So Catherine, over to you.
Thank you to the TCPA for hosting and to Jesse and Hugh for their comments so far. I hope to build on some of the themes they have already covered, indeed, specifically on the insurance challenge. As Jesse said, I'm Catherine Gregg. I work at Flood Re. I previously worked in the New York City Mayor's Office of Resiliency and Recovery, where I was responsible for coordinating building codes and planning policy concerning flood risk mapping, and flood insurance policy. While the context is different in the UK, many of the challenges are similar and are also the focus of my work at Flood Re. This may seem off topic, but almost 2 years ago, there was an exhibit at the V&A called The Future Starts Here. At the entrance, they had a quote by the French philosopher Paul Virilio, who said, "The invention of the ship was also the invention of the shipwreck." I hope to tell you a story today about insurance, how Flood Re came to be, what drives flood risk, and to make a bold claim, specifically that insurable homes can and must be planned. Having said that, insurance is a terrible product. It's hard to understand, it's hard to see the value, and in the best case, you get no return. Why do we buy insurance? If we can afford it, we buy insurance to protect ourselves and loved ones against unknown risks. For most people, their home is their most valuable possession, and home insurance allows them to transfer the risk of something happening to their home to a third-party insurance company. Also, banks are often co-investors in a home as they hold the mortgage. Therefore, it makes sense that they generally require buyers to have some home insurance. More on this aspect later. Let me expand on home and flood insurance. Flood risk in the UK is covered by a standard home insurance product. This is not the case in many other places, where it is often a separate policy. How does insurance generally work? For many perils, such as fire and tree damage, risks are pooled and spread across the premiums of all the properties, because households generally face the same risk that event will happen. This is not the case with flood, which often is highly localized. This causes a dilemma for insurers such that they have two options. Option one is they carry on offering insurance and face large and persistent claims from flood-prone homeowners, which makes their business unprofitable. Or option two, they stop insuring high-risk areas, i.e. they use better statistical and environmental data and then restrict the availability of insurance or introduce much higher premiums for people in flood-prone areas. Since the former option is not commercially sustainable, left to its own devices, the insurance industry would adopt the second option. To mitigate this option, beginning in 2002, the relationship between insurers and government was laid out in a statement of principles. This was a set of commitments by the industry to provide flood insurance for domestic properties and small businesses as long as government invested in flood risk management. There were separate but virtually identical agreements for England, Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. However, in 2007, extreme rainfall led to widespread flooding, causing 13 deaths and $3 billion in damage, and was deemed the largest peacetime emergency in the UK since World War II. Insurers became jittery. Thus, in response to the major floods, the Statement of Principles was updated in 2008. This is a really important date. DEFRA worked with insurers to ensure that cover would continue to be available to the vast majority of households. However, to avoid the moral hazard of risky homes being built in the floodplain or in a manner that was not resilient, the revised statement carved out new properties and did not apply to buildings constructed after the 1st of January 2009. This restriction continues today. Therefore, no properties built after 2008 are eligible for flood recover. That said, even after the revised Statement of Principles, flooding continued, leading to efforts on behalf of both industry and government to find a long-term solution. In March 2014, the Water Act published what would be in and out of scope for flood re. Of note is that small businesses were excluded because determining business-specific insurance would highly complicate rate setting for flood re. A hair salon, for example, needs very different coverage from a bookshop. After much negotiation between insurers and government, flood re launched in April 2016 with the purpose to address the availability and affordability of flood insurance for private residential property, especially for previously flooded properties and those in high-risk areas. The scheme was set up to have a lifespan of 25 years, with the intent that over that time frame, flood risk could be reduced so that flood re would no longer be needed. To that end, our interpretation of flood re's purpose is to support, through research and advocacy, and events such as this, cost-efficient investment in flood adaptation strategies ranging from flood warnings to individual structure-based resiliency measures to enhanced hard and nature-based defenses, as well as smart planning. How does flood re actually work? From the perspective of the homeowner, they need not have any awareness that flood re exists. This is because from their perspective, the process of buying home insurance through a comparison website, for example, hasn't changed at all. That said, here's a more detailed view of the operations. Bear with me. First, starting with the insurers, UK home insurers pay an annual levy to flood re based on their market share. Using this levy, flood re purchases reinsurance sold by reinsurance companies. This is basically insurance for insurers. Then, as mentioned before, from the customer's viewpoint, the experience is the same. Customers buy insurance from a broker or online from an insurance company. Customers generally receive information about their flood risk from the insurance company. From the insurer's point of view, they assess the level of risk. They also decide which policies to cede to Flood Re, i.e. it's up to the insurance company to determine whether it makes sense to take a possibly subsidized rate from Flood Re to allow them to price the overall homeowner's policy at a more affordable rate. The insurer then sets the price for the home insurance policy and pays a fixed rate according to the council tax band of the property for the flood part of the policy to Flood Re. Flood Re then accepts eligible risks at the fixed rate per policy. Then, in the event a customer makes a valid claim, the insurance company pays out to the customer. If the policy is ceded to Flood Re pays the cost of the claim to the insurer. So what do premiums actually cost? Insurers do not share details regarding their rate setting. However, across all homes, i.e. not just those ceded to Flood Re, between January and June 2018, Money Supermarket did an analysis of premiums that showed two factors that increased premiums related to flooding. The first is a 149 premium increase for a prior history of flooding. The second is a 32-pound increase if one's home is within 400 meters of water. By comparison, for flood reseeded properties, we see much higher average annual premiums. For example, for council tax band A properties, the average market premium is 380 pounds per year. These higher costs all reflect higher risk of flooding. Thus far, I've told you a bit about insurance, how Flood Re came to be, and now I'll cover what drives flood risk and the link to development. On a basic level, we see four types of flooding: coastal, river, surface water, and groundwater. In particular, I particularly want to highlight surface water flooding, which most closely aligns to where I started remarks with shipbuilding. If there isn't a structure, we just have a muddy field. With development, we create the shipwreck such that the high intensity rainfall overwhelms drainage systems and concrete surfaces, preventing water from draining away. Polluted water can then back up drains, resulting in surface water flooding. What does the future hold in terms of population growth? The population has risen steadily since the 1850s, and by the 2040s, will have almost tripled. Over the next 20 years, the population is expected to grow by about 8 million people, roughly the current population of New York City. You saw this picture in Hugh's remarks, but the question is, where will these homes go? In some respects, that's for you to decide. You may have seen this photo, as I said before. The sign here reads, development site with permission for 30 dwellings. So I challenge you with the mission of doing everything in your power not to build shipwrecks. And note that the Bank of England is also watching out for ships that could wreck banks. Specifically, with increasing climate change, banks have been asked to assess the impact of physical and transition risks on their portfolios. Further, the PRA will soon be asking banks to consider the impact of changes in the provision of insurance for certain physical risks, such as flooding, and to examine the interaction between banks and insurers. So here are my 3 takeaways. First, think about the expected life of the development and build with the future in mind. Noting that Flood Re comes to an end in 2039, and as I explained earlier, does not provide insurance for properties built after 2009. However, many properties will last more than 100 years. One way to do this, and I think Sam will cover this in more detail next, is to check the long-term flood risk of your development. This site is for England, but similar resources exist for Wales, Scotland, and Northern Ireland. Second, explore new building types. This is the home for all seasons, the 2016 winner of the Sunday Times Award for the most resilient home. The key design principles are as follows. Living zones are positioned at the first floor level. This avoids reliance on temporary measures for flood protection. The ground floor or garden room is flood resilient and can quickly be adapted and cleaned post a flood. Water and power utilities are elevated to enable continuity of services during a flood event. And the building has a minimal hard standing footprint, which provides space for the integration of suds, swales, and avoids displacing water to surrounding developments. 3, strive for multiple lines of defense. Here you see a resilient kitchen with elevated appliances and belongings stored in water-resistant containers. And I'm almost done. So I go back to where I started. Insurable homes can and must be planned because insurable homes are vibrant and resilient homes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Catherine, for that great presentation. Just a reminder to all the participants, if you have any questions for our speakers, please do put them in the question and answer box and we will respond to as many as possible at the end of the session. So moving on to our next speaker, which is Sam Kipling, who is Flood and Coastal Risk Management Senior Advisor at the Environment Agency. Sam is going to give an introduction to the Environment Agency work and explore the implications of planning decisions on flood risk. So, Sam, over to you.
Thank you, Jessie. Thanks for the opportunity of speaking today. For those of you who are lucky enough not to have experienced flooding, flooding is absolutely horrendous. It's dirty, it's invasive, it's damaging, and ultimately it can kill. And whilst flooding can often be short-lived, its effects, both physical and mental, are often very long-lasting. Floods can force people to leave their homes and their businesses. They destroy livelihoods, natural habitats, and other valued places. And even at their best, flooding is often inconvenient and disruptive. We know that repeat flooding can cause long-term economic blight. Small businesses fail, more employers move away. And we also know that flood exposure increases the chances of having poor mental health by around 50%. And next slide, please. We also know that for every person directly affected by a large flood, around 16 more suffer knock-on effects from things like the losses of utility services. And that's because over 2/3 of our properties in England are served by infrastructure and infrastructure networks that are located within areas that are at risk of flooding. So whilst you might have dry carpets at home, if you can't get to work, to the doctors, if you've got perhaps no power for lighting or heating, no phone, or perhaps you can't even flush the toilet, then that flood has affected you. And this certainly serves to highlight that if our infrastructure itself isn't resilient, then our places, our communities aren't resilient either. But unfortunately, the scale of making our communities and our infrastructure resilient is a massive challenge, and you'll see some statistics here about the extent to which our country's infrastructure is at risk from flooding. Next slide, please. We have come a really long way in rising to this challenge of delivering a resilient country. In 1953, a huge storm surge affected the east coast of England and mainland Europe, and over 300 people died in England, more like around 2,000 in Belgium and the Netherlands. At the time, there were very few formal flood defences, no forecasting and warning system, no mobile phone network, few landlines in fact, and many very poor quality post-war prefabricated buildings. And most people had absolutely no forewarning that flooding was imminent, even though many areas of the country had already been severely affected by flooding by the same event nearly half a day earlier. But thankfully, we've come a long way since 1953. Next slide, please. In 2013, there were no fatalities during a much stronger storm surge, and that's because of the warnings, evacuation procedures and flood defences that have been much improved. 18,000 people were the subject of an evacuation from threatened communities. Over 160,000 flood warnings were issued, and 800,000 properties were protected by Environment Agency flood defences. And we're lucky enough now to have significant pieces of infrastructure, such as tidal barriers on the rivers Thames and the rivers Hull, amongst others, protecting large areas of built-up towns and cities. We're now able to forecast and issue flood warnings by phone and text and email days in advance of storm surges. And we also have demountable defences in many places like Sandwich in Kent, as shown here, which can be erected in advance of large-scale events that have that prior warning. Next slide, please. But unfortunately, as others have alluded to, the scale of the challenge isn't standing still, it's increasing because of the impact of climate change. And climate change is the biggest risk we face, and it's the biggest risk because it's a risk amplifier. It takes all the existing challenges that we face and turns them all up. And the most recent climate predictions reaffirm that we will experience warmer, wetter winters, hotter, drier summers, with an increased likelihood of more intense rainfall leading to flooding. In 2017, the government published its second iteration of its National Climate Change Risk Assessment, which appraises the risks that the nation faces from climate change. And you'll see that flood risk and coastal change are the top risks that we face. Sea levels have already risen by around 20 centimetres since 1900, and as you mentioned, could rise by over a metre, 1.6 metres in places by 2125, really intensifying flood risks and coastal change for exposed communities. It's expected that the numbers of people at significant risk of flooding and coastal change could increase from 1.8 million to 2.6 million by around 2050, and that's even with low rates of population growth. High temperatures are also a significant risk. It's anticipated that the number of heat-related deaths is expected to more than triple by the 2050s, and pressure on water resources is the third risk identified, with a combination of reducing rainfall and growing populations working together to put greater stress on water supplies. Next slide, please. And clearly, government felt that climate change was of such great importance that it warranted the imposition of a rare legal duty on local planning authorities when producing their local plans. As you said, it was inserted by the 2008 Act into the 2004 Act, and the legal duty states that in the preparation of development plan documents, these policies must be designed to contribute to climate change mitigation and adaptation. Next slide, please. And the NPPF, thankfully, has been unequivocal since its introduction in 2012 that new development should be planned for in ways that avoid increased vulnerability to climate change. And we at the Environment Agency are supporting this by helping practitioners such as yourselves translate complicated climate science into user-friendly guidance in our climate change allowances. And these apply to both site-specific flood risk assessments undertaken by developers, but also to strategic flood risk assessments undertaken by local planning authorities. And they provide allowances for peak rainfall intensity that can inform our understanding of surface water flood risk and drainage design, but also peak river flow and sea level rise, plus related wind and wave action and storm surge. And the ethos of our guidance is that the lifetime of development should be considered, that a range of different climate scenarios should be analysed to understand what the potential range of outcomes could be, and the sensitivities that a site or development might be subject to. And we advocate for greater precaution for those developments that are of greater vulnerability and which have a longer life. Next slide, please. But because the scale and the nature of this challenge is not stationary, we need to move the nation from a concept of protection to one of resilience. We can't continue to build our way out of all climate risks. Traditional flood and sea defences will absolutely remain vitally important, but we can't continue to build them to protect every place against all risks. In different places, we'll need to call on a broader range of resilience tools. And our National Flood and Coastal Erosion Risk Management Strategy, our strategy, which was published this week, for those of you who haven't seen, sets out a national ambition for England, but it's one that can be adapted so that it's possible to work in every place, recognising that every place is different and that there isn't and can't be a one-size-fits-all solution to delivering resilience. We also have to recognise that there are huge opportunities to deliver resilience in a way which allows communities to prosper and to grow, and which provides multiple benefits for the people that live and work there and to the wildlife that we share it with. This graphic here is taken from our national strategy, and it could represent the toolbox of measures that we could draw upon to deliver place-based resilience. And you'll notice circled there the crucial role of planning and making good land use decisions to make sure that development is in the best places and is designed in a resilient way. Next slide, please. Because of the changing nature of risk, the national strategy also introduces this concept of adaptation pathways, this idea of taking an iterative and dynamic approach to our decisions about resilience, looking out to the end of the century and well beyond in some cases. The idea is that we understand the range of climate scenarios, climate impacts that we might face, and that we pre-plan along with other placemakers and infrastructure providers. We pre-plan the interventions that are likely to be needed in places at different times, so that we can call upon those pre-planned interventions when they're needed. The graphic here, which attempts to visualise that concept, comes from the Thames Estuary 2100 strategy, which is out of interest in the midst of its review. Next slide, please. Clearly, the most important, the most effective planning tool at our disposal is the concept of avoidance. We at the Environment Agency, we have around 7,000 kilometres of flood defence walls and embankments, but unfortunately, sometimes they fail, or the standard for which they were designed is exceeded by a large flood event. We also know that sometimes we get the weather forecast wrong, as Michael Fish here famously missing the onset of a hurricane. Sometimes people are on holiday when they need to put flood barriers in place. In Yorkshire, we had a huge event on Boxing Day, and many people who relied upon property flood resilience measures such as this were away visiting friends and family for Christmas celebrations. We also know, unfortunately, that our demountable defences can sometimes not end up in the place that they're needed at the right time. The defences in Upton-on-Severn famously caught in a lorry on a congested motorway during the onset of flooding. The congestion, of course, caused in part by the flooding and the ongoing flood event. Next slide, please. So clearly, we can't avoid all development in flood risk areas, and where it does have to take place, it's crucial that the planning system plays its role in making sure that it's located and laid out and designed in a way which provides resilience to climate change. And there are two strong examples here of incorporating flood resilient design and development, raising floor levels, lifting the vulnerable uses to upper floors, leaving space for water to flow and be stored during times of flood, and also using developer contributions to help to pay for flood defences, which will not only reduce the probability of flooding to the development itself, but will also protect wider existing communities. Next slide, please. There are also some further examples here in York and Riverside properties of apartments being pushed up onto upper floors with floodable, flood resilient undercroft parking below and safe access to the rear. The 2012 MPPF also included a policy which requires local plans or local planning authorities, when preparing local plans, to identify areas where existing development, including homes and infrastructure, may over time become unsustainable because of the predicted impacts of climate change on coastal erosion or on flood risk. And there's a good example here at the Spurn Point Visitor Centre in the East Riding of Yorkshire, which was built in an area of high flood risk, in an area of where that risk is expected to increase significantly over time. And there are some novel controls built into the planning permission for that flood risk to be revisited and periodically reviewed, with ultimate conditions in the planning permission that will require disassembly and relocation in future if those risks get to an unacceptable level. Next slide, please. It's also becoming really clear to us that it's not possible or sensible to separate the management of flood risk and coastal change from how we manage our natural environment. Our natural environment provides a huge range of assets and services under the headline of natural capital, from carbon sequestration and water purification right through things like pollination and amenity value. So wherever possible, we should be looking at approaches that deliver resilience at the same time as delivering this wide range of other benefits to people and wildlife. And we know the government is taking forward a proposal to mandate for 10% net gain in biodiversity as a result of development. And we're hoping that techniques such as natural flood management and sustainable drainage will become go-to options for developers to help deliver on that biodiversity net gain mandate. I've also included some pictures here from Leeds Flood Alleviation Scheme, which is the biggest natural flood management flood alleviation scheme of its kind in the country. And this combines traditional flood defences in Leeds and in Appley Bridge with broader catchment interventions upstream in neighbouring authorities of Craven and Bradford, and to slow the flow and to reduce the speed with which water flows down in a flood event. Next slide, please. We can also intelligently design flood risk management interventions so that they serve multiple purposes. So there are some great examples here of flood defences that incorporate footpaths and cycle paths, pocket parks, defences that demount into park benches here, and a great example of a multifunctional sud, making a beautiful place to live and work. The example in the middle is a pocket park in Sheffield, where a nominal £15,000 intervention under the Water Framework Directive funding delivered huge benefits for the adjacent development site, increasing its value and its desirability. Next slide, please. So just to conclude, planning plays a really crucial role in climate change adaptation. We should absolutely continue to avoid building in flood risk areas and areas of coastal change unless we absolutely have to. But where it's unavoidable, and planning plays a really important role in making sure that what's built is designed in a resilient way that fully understands the risks it faces both now and in the future, and that it's designed to be resilient to those changes. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Sam. So our final speaker is Gemma Holmes. Gemma is the Adaptation Lead Analyst on the Built Environment and Health at the Committee on Climate Change. So Gemma is going to introduce the Committee on Climate Change and the Adaptation Subcommittee and outline the key findings of their latest reports. Hopefully this will be how they can be used by local authorities. Over to you, Gemma. Thanks.
Thanks, Jessie. Thank you all for inviting me to talk to you today. I've been having some broadband problems, so I'm hotspotting, so I'm going to turn my video off just to make sure I don't lose connection and I can keep talking. So I was asked to chat today to give you an overview on the Committee on Climate Change and our role within climate adaptation, and to provide you with some of our key findings and recommendations from the committee's latest reports. And finally, how local authorities can use our committee's work. I'm obviously going to talk about flooding, but I'm also going to touch on other aspects of adaptation, such as water, overheating, and the natural environment. Next slide, please. So the committee are the government's official independent advisors on climate change. The committee was established under the Climate Change Act in 2008. The Act itself has 4 key aims. The first is around providing a goal to 2050, which is now our net zero target. The second is to provide a pathway in order to get to that target. And the third is to give us a toolkit. So that's the requirement of the government to bring forward policies and understand climate risks. And the fourth is where the committee comes into it, is to provide a monitoring framework where the committee can monitor progress on both mitigation and adaptation and suggest changes. Next slide, please. So a little bit more about the committee itself. So the CCC is actually made up of 2 separate committees, one which deals with mitigation, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and the other one on adaptation. So I'm going to focus here on the Adaptation Committee. The committee is chaired by Baroness Brown of Cambridge, who's an engineer by background, and then it's made up of academics, economists, and business representatives. The committee has 2 statutory roles within the Act. The first is to provide independent expert advice on the UK climate change risk assessment, and the second is to report to Parliament on progress implementing the government's national adaptation programme for England only. So I'll talk about each of these in a little bit more detail on the next slide. So next slide, please. So this slide shows the UK climate change adaptation policy cycle. So the Climate Change Act puts in place some statutory measures for the government. The first is that the government must produce a climate change risk assessment every 5 years, and that assessment sets out the most urgent risks facing the UK from climate change and where action should be prioritised over the next 5 years. Following a risk assessment, which we call the CCRA, the government and the government of the devolved nations should then produce adaptation programmes, which then set out the policies and proposals needed to manage those risks that were identified in CCRA. The committee comes into it because the committee provides advice on the CCRA by producing an evidence report, and that is basically where we bring together all of the latest evidence on climate risk in the UK. And as you can see sort of on that timeline around where we are now, 2020, 2021, we're currently working towards producing the 3rd climate change risk assessment evidence report, which will be published in June next year. The government will then publish its main risk assessment in 2022. The committee also, once every 2 years, scrutinises the government's progress in adapting to climate change in England only. So this is mainly looking at the implementation of the National Adaptation Programme. And we do that scrutiny in the form of a progress report to Parliament. So our last progress report was published in 2019, and we're starting work on our 2021 progress report now. The committee also produces ad hoc reports into topics which are relevant or where more action is needed. So for example, in recent years, we've published reports on housing, coastal change and the natural environment. The housing and the natural environment reports were actually joint with the mitigation committee. So they really tried to take that holistic view of what is needed to address climate change impacts from the point of view of reducing emissions and adapting to climate change. So in the following slides, I'm going to basically present some of the findings and recommendations from our recent reports. I should say that the committee's remit is usually UK-wide or England only. So we do tend to look at things at that national level rather than a local scale. And obviously local level risks and appropriate actions and challenges can be significantly different. But I've tried to pull out those points that are most relevant to local action and local planning, and where hopefully you could focus some action in the near term. So next slide, please. I won't spend too long on this one because you've already seen it as well. So the second climate change risk assessment evidence report set out 6 climate risk areas where urgent action was needed. And these were around flooding and coastal change, health, well-being and productivity from high temperatures, shortages in water, as well as risks to natural capital, agriculture and soils, impacts on food production, trade, and also pests, diseases, and non-native species. Okay, next slide, please. So this little box chart here, I know it's quite difficult to read some of that text, so hopefully you can look at it later more closely. This shows our key findings from the 2019 progress report. The headline finding was that we're not prepared for even a 2-degree rise in global temperatures, let alone 4. So within our progress report, we take each sector of the economy and we split it out into what we call adaptation priorities. And then we rank those priorities based on quality of adaptation planning and progress in managing those risks that were set out within the CCRA. And so what we found in 2019 was that there are 12 priority areas that have no long-term plans to address climate risks, and none of the sectors scored well on risk reduction, even when plans are good. So some of the worst scored areas, which are in that top right box, which was scored a 1, were terrestrial habitats and species, agricultural productivity, looking at surface water flooding and new development, and infrastructure interdependencies. Next slide, please. So looking at some of our findings and recommendations that hopefully most relevant to local planning in a bit more detail. So progress in managing flooding and coastal change. We're hoping that with the release of the new flooding and coastal erosion risk management strategy, that some of our river and coastal flooding scores will increase markedly, because hopefully that strategy is setting out some long-term outcomes, and we'll be assessing that for our 2021 progress report. One of the findings that we brought out in 2019 was that the uptake of things like property level flood resilience measures is far below where it needs to be, and exposure to flooding through new developments is increasing. So this map that is shown here is very new data. It's from one of our research project, which is feeding into the our next CCRA evidence report, and it shows the proportion of new development in the floodplain in the past 5 to 10 years. It is a relatively small number of properties that are built each year in areas of significant flood risk that are not already protected and go against EA advice. But although this is a small number, it is still increasing the number of properties every year that are in those high risk categories over time. A much higher number of properties are built in at-risk flood areas where flood protection are in place, which would limit present day impacts, but it still increases the number of properties and people vulnerable to flooding now and in the future, where developments do need to be in sort of the floodplain or flood areas. We really want to see that assessments are made to check whether current defences are going to be sufficient to manage future risks. We want to see increased property level flood resilience, and we want to see people looking at things like those natural flood risk management. And that sort of links to that next point there around flood re. We want to see a clear plan in place for the transition and the withdrawal of flood re in 2039, including some sort of strategies and targets in order to accelerate implementation of property level flood resilience measures. In terms of coastal flooding, a couple of the findings from our 2019 reports were that quite often local plans and the shoreline management plans are not always well aligned, but they should be more closely. And there may be needed new powers for local authorities in order to facilitate relocation of coastal communities in the future, or to ensure that a longer term planning outlook can be taken within local planning. Next slide, please. Okay, just to continue on the flooding, we also want to see goals and targets put in place to try and reverse the national decline in urban green space. Urban green space has unfortunately been declining for the last couple of years, and I'm sure a lot of you are already aware that it can bring a whole host of multiple benefits, not just flood resilience. So things like having green space retrofit programs included in local plans would be great, and incorporating the National Green Infrastructure Standards from the 25-year Environment Plan into local planning. Surface water flooding still remains a big issue. Our report concluded that there's still a lack of evidence of priority being given to green suds, and it's likely the risk of surface water flooding will continue to increase in the future. So we need to see stronger policy on suds and make sure that green suds are the default in new developments. So that is a little bit set out in the NPPF, but it needs, implementation in local planning and consents on new developments. Our second point at the end there is something that we've recommended a number of times, and it's about sort of removing the automatic right to connect new developments to the sewer system, being made conditional on national SUD standards being met. And finally, we want to see clarification of arrangements of who is adopting and maintaining SUDs. So ensuring like developers work with local water companies, for example. Next slide, please. Okay, I just wanted to put in a couple of slides about other points as well, the committee's findings that are relevant to sort of local authorities and local planning. So this slide's about housing, sort of infrastructure and emergency response. In terms of water efficiency, there's widespread recognition of the need for greater ambitions on demand management. For recommendations we've made to government, we recommended that government should allow local authorities to set more ambitious water efficiency standards within local plans, being able to go further than what's set out in building regulations, especially in current and future water stressed areas. We also want building regs updated to reflect this. Other recommendations are that local authorities could look to include water efficiency measures alongside energy efficiency retrofit programs, for example, and include water efficiency in social housing standards. On overheating, the extent to which overheating is included in local authority plans and strategies varies. The review of the heatwave plan in England did find that local authorities often assess heat waves at a lower risk than other weather-related hazards, and possibly because it's seen as more of a longer-term risk. But I guess there's sort of a chance there that actually planners are not preparing for those future increases in heat that could have quite a large impact on people's health in homes and buildings. So we've recommended that overheating should be integrated within local plans and planning. And we've made extensive recommendations to MHCLG on the need to amend building regulations on overheating risk. And finally, the last 2 points on this slide are a little bit about sort of infrastructure and local resilience forums. So it's not entirely clear what data sharing is occurring between infrastructure providers, emergency services, and local resilience forums. So we've recommended that the Cabinet Office should ensure that data sharing is taking place between all of those providers. Our 2019 report did say that the emergency response system is stretched, and the capacity to respond in some areas to significant weather events is decreasing, and those factors need to be assessed and addressed to ensure emergency planning is fit for future climate impacts. Next slide, please. I've just put this slide in on land use. As a caveat, this is the area I know least about, so I will whiz through this slide. So as well as following recommendations and targets set out in the 25-year Environment Plan, the committee have recommended that we want to see adaptation integrated into environmental land management systems. We want to see land use building and resilience, so things like diversifying agricultural land, afforestation, peatland restorations, and catchment management, all of which have positive impacts on the condition of natural habitats and habitat creation. We also want to see resources that explain local climate impacts and risks to land managers, and support being provided to help land managers transition to alternative land uses. Next slide, please. And final point was some wider recommendations that the committee have made in the past couple of years to government about local action. Obviously, a lot of what I've said isn't necessarily so easy when resources in local authorities are stretched, and funding and guidance is very scarce. So we have recommended that the government should re-establish a support service on adaptation for local authorities, and the government also needs to address the urgent funding needs and resources to ensure that local authorities do have the incentives and support in order to take action on climate change. And the committee do know that the government is trying to look at how they can do this, but we don't know anything more than that at the moment. On building regulations, I've touched on this already, but yeah, we've given a lot of recommendations on having a review and changes on building regs to allow local authorities to go further. And finally, a point on sort of local authority, the government continuing to develop stronger subnational approaches to adaptation and making full use of devolved powers. Next slide, please. This is my last slide. How can local authorities make use of our figures and resources? We have an excellent website which hosts all of our reports and our letters on there. You could use our recommendations and findings from the progress reports to help you push for action. Some of our more specific reports, especially the coastal and the housing report, have lots of very detailed conclusions on what is needed, and that could help drive what is put into local plans and local planning. The next CCRA evidence report, as I've said, will be published next year, so look out for that. But the research projects that are feeding into that have already been published, and they are on that climate risk website, which I've put up there. Two of the key ones are updated projections of flood risk and water supply, and the results, I believe, are broken down to some extent by local authority region, so they are worth having a look at to help understand future risk. In addition, you've got the Met Office's latest climate projections, which can be found online with lots of guidance on how to interpret them. And finally, there are many examples of where actions are pushing ahead locally and in groups, so things like the Core Cities, UK 100 and UK Resilient Cities. Thank you. That was all I had to say.
Brilliant, thank you, Gemma. That is fantastic. I'm just trying to start, there we go. So I think we've reached the end of our presentations, and we now have about 20 minutes for some discussion and to answer some of the questions that everyone has sent in. So yeah, panelists, if I can ask you to turn your cameras and microphones back on. Gemma, you can leave your camera off if you want to. So to start this off, I'm going to pass back over to Hugh, who has got a couple of questions of his own for the speakers, and then we will answer some of the ones from the audience.
In fact, I'm just going to direct one to Sam, if that's okay, because I'm conscious there's loads of questions to get through. So, but I think that question, Sam, because we're old friends, it can be I can be unfair. I can see in the chat there is some confusion about two things: the application of sequential test and the exception test, which is a challenge. And then there's questions I have about the application of the really critical document, which is the government's, the EA's flood risk allowances estimates. And in that document, you get a number, don't you, of 4 key tables about river flows, sea level rise, rainfall intensity. And in each of those, it appears that you're asking local authorities to make a choice about medium, high end, or H++ scenarios. It's quite hard for a district council, isn't it, to make a judgment about which one of those to pick. Do you think there's enough clarity about how those factors should go into flood risk assessment? And could you just say in 20 seconds the perfect application of the sequential and exception test, please?
Absolutely not, George. Okay, so on the climate change allowances, we advocate for an approach where a range of different scenarios is assessed. For one main reason, which is that we try to be science-led. And the climate science is really an uncertain science, particularly where it looks to the very long term. And the alternative, of course, to assessing a range of impact is to pick one. and there are clearly many advantages to just picking one as well. The main ones being that you either are too precautionary or not precautionary enough. It's worth highlighting that across that range of scenarios, often the risk doesn't increase in a proportionate way. Often there are what's called cliff edge effects, where the risk and the nature of that risk can change very suddenly from, for example, being quite benign flooding to suddenly being very serious. So the hope is that assessing that range of impacts will help to reveal those sorts of sensitivities and will inform the choices that developers and local planning authorities make about what the best mitigation approach is. As far as the sequential and exception test are concerned, it's something that we're looking at in quite a lot of detail at the moment in the review that MHCRG are undertaking of planning policy and process. And the evidence that we've gathered on that just show lots of inconsistency in application and understanding of the tests. But for the reasons I set out in my presentation, the sequential test, insofar as it seeks to avoid flood risk, should remain a key priority. And there are some good examples of local authorities tackling the sequential test really well, usually through the process of local guidance notes setting out how this test should be applied for certain developments in their area, particularly in relation to things like search area and the like. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Sam. I will no doubt delve into more detail in that as we go through these training sessions. But for audience purposes, if you want my 30-year-long professional judgment, it would be very foolish to plan for anything but the highest end emission scenario in terms of impact. Others can't say that. I certainly will as a practicing planner. If we're planning for 1.5, 1.6 meters of sea level rise on the East Coast in 100 years time, then, you know, these rules of thumb sometimes sound easier to understand, aren't they, for communities? Actually plan for the worst case scenario. That's what everything from farming to how we run our households do. And that's what we should do in this instance.
Yeah, in the main, our climate change allowances guidance are based on an emissions pathway, which we think is very precautionary. It's known as RCP 8.5. So it's the high emissions scenario, if you like. So we're being, describe it how you will, pragmatic about our prospects of getting our emissions down over time. And clearly the allowances are revisited on a regular basis. And if our sort of forecast for that, if our advice on that changes over time, then we can revisit them. But our guiding principle at the moment is to plan for a 4-degree world, which our allowances are based on. The allowances also include the H++ scenario, which is perhaps best described as a sort of credible worst case scenario, which we advocate the use of in certain limited circumstances. For example, large-scale infrastructure projects where an impact on the operation of that infrastructure project would have a ripple effect on larger areas and communities, or things like new towns or significant urban extensions where you're making a fundamental change to the land use and building the whole fabric of a place as a consequence. It might be sensible to do some sensitivity testing against H++ in those scenarios to make sure that we're not building our way down an adaptation dead end, if you like.
Thank you.
So we've had quite a lot of questions. Thank you to everyone who sent them in. Thought we'd kick off. We've had a couple about the planning reforms and planning white paper. So one is, how do you begin to plan for climate change with the proposed planning reforms that don't seem to focus on climate change? And also some more specific questions about how the white paper talks about design for dwellings in England, and do you anticipate that specified designs will incorporate flood defence design, such as dwellings with habitable rooms starting at first floor level? So Hugh, I don't know whether you want to start off on this.
In 2 seconds, the planning white paper is a very poorly drafted document, very difficult to understand, and I frankly have no idea what they thought they were intending to do, but it certainly wasn't written with climate change in mind. That said, I suggest people say that in their responses. And also, I'm sure, Sam, you'll say a word perhaps about the parallel review that's going on that we hope will have some influence over the outcome of planning in the future. But there is something very important here, because whether this gets implemented or not, the issue of design guides and pattern books, which you know, all know the white paper is absolutely focused on, will, I think, be a bigger feature of planning. And at the moment, the white paper doesn't say how the sorts of resilience measures that would be critical in new design will go into them. But look out for the government's publication of their new National Design Code guidance, which is due before Christmas. Now, that's a really important document in setting the overall framework about housing standards. And you'll see in there whether or not actually the game, if you like, is honest on climate change, whether we see this transformational change in the design of places, because everything that's in the chat about how places will have to change is absolutely right if we're going to deliver on what Catherine wants for intrinsically resilient properties. But I don't know if, Sam, you can say any more about the review process on planning for flood risk.
Yeah, sure. Well, just to start, really, I think existing planning policies and guidance are pretty good, really, pretty robust on flood resilient design, albeit they take a flexible approach where the principles set out in guidance can be applied in such a way that it works for each place. And I think in many ways that's a good approach, because each place is different, and one flood resilient design in one place perhaps wouldn't work or would cause wider planning issues elsewhere. I think there are risks and opportunities that we have to consider in the planning white paper. In some ways, if we can build in greater levels of prescription on flood resilient design in national standards or in like local design codes, then it could improve consistency and drive up standards. It could be an opportunity to do that, but there is a danger that in prescribing a particular approach, that we end up with designs that don't work in some places, or we end up restricting innovation, which can often bring about some innovative solutions to problems which not only deal with flood risk and resilience, but also help to manage better some of the tensions that sometimes exist between flood mitigation and other planning issues like access or street scene or overshadowing, all those kind of things. So we definitely trying to make the most of the opportunities that it presents.
Thank you. Catherine, we've had a couple of questions specifically about flood re. So one is, do you have any evidence that the withdrawal of flood insurance or flood re has influenced the location of new development? And also, are there any plans in place to address the protection gap for properties built since 2009, or is the assumption that all properties built post 2009 are intrinsically resilient does that still stand?
Yeah, happy to take both of those. So on the withdrawal, the map that Gemma showed of development that they've done as part of the CCRA 3 analysis shows that indeed development has continued despite the unavailability of insurance for properties built. She did mention that there are not that many of them, but if you think of the financial recovery starting in 2008, development has begun, and indeed, this white paper, while it is silent on climate change, it is very aggressive on delivery. And I think that's where we need to sort of pull the brakes, or at least raise the flag of, listen, be careful what you deliver, because if your aims are for affordable housing that's built in silly places, you will create a train wreck. That ties to the protection gap. The history of flood re, which I walk through, was very deliberate in carving out properties built after 2008 when the negotiations began, which led to the establishment of flood re, so that new properties would avoid the moral hazard of being built in the floodplain. Therefore, we have intentionally no aspirations to expand our coverage for properties built after 2009. Having said that, there's a reason that we are speaking today in this event and sponsoring today's event almost as a protection gap for future building, because we want to be able to say we were aware of the issue, and if people don't understand that insurance isn't available, then you're creating the shipwreck. going back to the analogy of my paper, of my presentation.
Great, thanks, Catherine. So just flicking through, we've got lots of other questions. Sam, a couple more for you. Surface water is such a big risk affecting so many people. Why does this not have more emphasis in the flood coastal risk management strategy? And supporting local authorities by improving references to surface water in planning practice guidance, would this be helpful?
Yes, absolutely. It is arguably the biggest risk that we face, flood risk that we face. Our long-term investment scenario suggests there are 3.2 million properties in the country at risk from surface water flooding, more than are at risk from rivers and the sea. So it's absolutely acknowledged as a really significant risk. Clearly the PIP review and the Floods and Water Management Act served to close many of the roles and responsibilities issues with dealing with surface water as a source of flooding, the creation of lead local flood authorities providing a clear lead on the management of those risks. In planning, though, there are, in my view, still some substantial gaps where surface water is concerned, particularly in relation to statutory consultation arrangements. There is no statutory consultation when development is proposed in areas that are at risk of high risk of flooding from surface water, and that inevitably will result in development taking place and having taken place already in those areas, and in a way which isn't resilient to those risks. And given the numbers of properties I've highlighted, this is a significant issue of national resilience. So I think the sooner we can close those gaps and make sure that development is built in a resilient way, the better. The Jenkins review recently also looked at surface water issues in some detail, including making a number of recommendations about the use of sustainable drainage systems being a key tool in addressing surface water risk, and the review suggested that policies in the NPPF were made clearer and more unequivocal, and that's something that we're considering and hoping to act on through the planning white paper and government's review of planning policies on flood risk.
Great, thanks, Sam. Gemma, a question for you. What sort of data are you looking for being shared? For example, on flood risk, the Environment Agency strategy refers to setting best practice regarding flood risk asset sharing. This does not require all infrastructure providers, such as Network Rail, to share data. So what sort of bodies would also be useful for risk management authorities such as yourselves? Would it be useful to get information from?
Yes, this was a comment around sort of linking to infrastructure and interdependencies, and working with local resilience forums when you see sort of severe weather events occur. So ideally what we want to see is a lot of coordinated action and shared vulnerabilities and risk between all of those groups within the local area. The Civil Contingencies Act places a duty on Category 1 and Category 2 responders in order to share operation and share information to enhance that coordination. However, the CCC have done surveys of local resilience forum and found that that isn't necessarily happening on the ground. And we have sort of been pushing Cabinet Office to try and, give us some reassurance that that is happening. So that was kind of where that comment came from. So yeah, it's being able to share and understand each other's risks and vulnerabilities to help coordinate action when events occur.
Great, thank you. I think we've got time for one or two more questions. So this is another one which could be for any of you actually. Given the climate emergency status and deadlines, why do you think it is not obligatory for all new development to incorporate resilience, e.g. ground source heat pumps, solar, electric vehicles, and also adaptation measures? Do you think this will happen as the result of the white paper? Hugh, do you want to start?
Well, it won't happen as a result of the white paper that's currently written now. Will it happen? Yes, because in order to fulfill mitigation requirements, it's going to happen. That's the transformation we're talking about. One positive thing I want to leave us with, it's also a frustration. We have all the technical armoury here on adaptation and on mitigation that we need. So this is actually much more an issue of political will. And as we come to the end of this session, the circularity of this is, unless we can get elected members and communities to have much greater awareness of climate impact and the processes around it, we're never going to transform this. And I do think on data, it's worth saying that people like local community action groups around flood risk often have fine-grained data, Sam, that the agency may not have about culverts and watercourses. And so we need to make sure communities are fully embedded in that. But I'll tell you my stark message to everyone, which is that there will be more and more impacts, and those impacts will be more and more severe. And then there'll be a tipping point where we have to move very rapidly to make the changes. And we need to be prepared for climate changes like the environment, other environmental issues. It just goes away and then comes back again every decade. This is going nowhere because the impacts, as Sam has set out, as Jen has set out, and as Catherine has set out, are going to be severe and relentless. That is the nature of the global climate science. So I do think it will happen. It's just a shame that in Europe, of course, and places we're not allowed to talk about, it's happening much faster and developing big new businesses as a result.
If I could add, Jesse, on the digital side of things, the thread, I suppose, that runs through the planning white paper consultation is the aspiration to use more digital technology, data-led planning decisions. And of course, in the world of flood risk, we are incredibly rich with good quality flood risk data and mapping, which puts us in a really strong place to make the most of those opportunities. And we're going to get significantly better off in around 2024 when our second iteration of our national flood risk assessment is published, which will produce a great deal more detailed flood risk information, helping to relieve the burden on developers and local planning authorities in preparing their risk assessments. Certainly one of the issues that we struggle with sometimes, as has been alluded to already, is the sharing of data. For instance, we produce a national risk of flooding from surface water map, and we provide local authorities the opportunity to feed in any local detailed work that they've done. But we know that there are many authorities out there who have done detailed work, but either they've done it in a way that prevents it from being incorporated, or they've declined to share it with us, meaning that national sort of map of surface water risk is less good than it otherwise would be. And I think there's perhaps an opportunity in the planning white papers review of things like the duty to cooperate, to build some data sharing strength into that, to try to improve the way public bodies and other infrastructure providers share data, so that the very most can be made of it. Thank you.
Thanks. Catherine or Gemma, did either of you have any final comments?
Not on my end. Thank you for hosting.
All right. So I think we've run out of time, unfortunately. We thank you everyone who sent questions, and we will also be sharing a recording of this webinar, and it will be on the TCPO website. So please do share it with your colleagues if you found it useful. Before we finish, I would just like to invite you to answer one more poll, which I'm just launching now. We'd be very grateful if you could respond to this quickly. While you're doing that, I'd like to thank our fantastic speakers, Hugh, Catherine, Sam and Gemma, and to my colleagues at the TCPA who have been making sure everything works. And also thank you to everyone who has joined this webinar. I hope you have found it helpful. Please do consider supporting the work of the TCPA by becoming a member if you are not already. And you can find further details on how to do this on our website. So thanks for answering the poll. It's great that you found it useful. When this webinar finishes, there will also be a survey. So if you have any other further comments about this webinar or other things you think it would be useful for us to do, we'd be very grateful to hear them. So yeah, thanks again for joining, and we hope to see you all again soon. Bye.